An arrogant Stanford professor publicly humiliates an elderly man who quietly enters his graduate seminar. He has no idea he's about to face the most embarrassing moment of his academic career. What starts as cruel mockery turns into a shocking revelation that will leave everyone speechless. The autumn air was crisp as students gathered in Stanford's prestigious Miller Hall for advanced literary theory. Among the sea of eager 20-somethings clutching expensive laptops, one figure seemed completely out of place. Albert Whitman, an 68-year-old man with gentle silver hair and kind brown eyes, quietly entered the lecture hall, carrying nothing but a weathered brown briefcase and a simple thermos. He wore a faded cardigan over pressed khaki pants, his shoes polished but clearly old. Wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose as he surveyed the room with quiet dignity. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Gothic windows, creating an atmosphere thick with academic tradition. A confident sophomore named Jake noticed the elderly stranger first. "Excuse me, sir, but I think you're lost. This is Professor Manning's graduate seminar on contemporary American fiction." His voice carried the casual dismissiveness of youth. Albert smiled warmly. "Oh no, young man, I'm exactly where I should be." He settled into a middle-row seat with careful precision, opening his briefcase to reveal a worn leather journal and an antique fountain pen. Whispers rippled through the classroom like wildfire. Who was this old man? Someone's grandfather? A confused retiree who wandered in by mistake? The graduate students exchanged glances, their curiosity mixed with barely concealed judgment. Sarah, a doctoral candidate, leaned toward her friend Michael. "Maybe he's part of that community outreach program. You know, bringing education to senior citizens or something." Michael shrugged, adjusting his designer backpack. "He doesn't look like he belongs here at all. This is Stanford, not some continuing education class at the local library." Albert arranged his simple materials with practiced ease, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He poured steaming coffee from his thermos into a small ceramic cup, the rich aroma mixing with the academic atmosphere of leather-bound books and fresh notebooks. "Good afternoon," Albert said softly to nearby students, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had lived through decades of change. A few responded with polite nods, though their expressions remained puzzled and somewhat condescending. As more students settled in, the chatter continued around Albert like he was invisible. In a world where Stanford visitors were typically distinguished professors, successful tech entrepreneurs, or wealthy donors, this humble elderly man seemed like an obvious mistake. The grandfather clock chimed 3 times. Conversations died as sharp footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing louder with each click. Professor Manning was approaching, and everyone knew his reputation for intellectual brutality. Albert straightened slightly, his eyes focusing on the doorway, with the intensity of someone who knew the next hour would be far more interesting than anyone could imagine. Professor David Manning burst into the classroom like a tornado. His Italian suit impeccable, his perfectly trimmed beard suggesting meticulous attention to detail. At 42, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been intellectually challenged, or at least never admitted defeat. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room with predatory precision, taking inventory of his academic domain. "Good afternoon, future scholars," he announced, his voice carrying theatrical authority that demanded immediate attention. He slammed his leather briefcase onto the desk with unnecessary force. Today we're exploring the deconstructionist approaches to postmodern narrative fragmentation. Manning declared, his gaze sweeping across familiar faces until it landed on Albert. His expression shifted from professional confidence to obvious irritation. "Excuse me," Manning said, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "This is an advanced graduate seminar, not a senior citizen activity program. I believe you've made a mistake." The room fell deadly silent. Students shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension that had suddenly thickened the air like fog. Albert looked up from his journal, his expression serene as a calm lake. "No mistake, Professor. The dean's office arranged my visit for today's discussion." Albert's voice carried no defensiveness, just quiet certainty. Manning's jaw tightened visibly. He wasn't accustomed to being contradicted, especially by someone who looked like he should be feeding pigeons in a park, rather than attending Stanford's most exclusive literary seminars. "The dean's office? I received no notification about any visitor." He pronounced visitor like it was a dirty word. "Perhaps the memo got lost in your busy schedule," Albert suggested gently. These administrative mix-ups happen frequently. The professor's face flushed slightly. David Manning had built his entire reputation on being meticulously organized, on controlling every aspect of his academic environment. The suggestion that he had missed something felt like a personal attack. "Well," Manning forced a smile that looked more like a grimace, "I suppose we can accommodate a curious community member, though I should warn you that we'll be discussing complex theoretical frameworks that require years of specialized training to comprehend properly." Sarah winced. She recognized that tone. Professor Manning was like a shark who had just smelled blood in the water. This sweet old man had no idea what storm was coming. "That's very thoughtful of you," Albert replied, opening his journal to a fresh page. "I do appreciate opportunities to learn new perspectives." Manning began writing on the blackboard with unnecessarily aggressive strokes. Post-structuralist theory, Derrida, Foucault, Barthes. His voice took on the condescending tone he typically reserved for undergraduates who clearly hadn't done the required reading. The trap was being set, and Albert sat calmly in the center of it, completely unaware of the academic execution that Manning was planning. Manning positioned himself directly in front of Albert's desk, his smile sharp as a razor blade. The graduate students sensed what was coming, their pens hovering over notebooks as they prepared to witness what promised to be an uncomfortable intellectual massacre. Mr. Manning paused, letting the question hang in the air like smoke. "Whitman," Albert replied pleasantly. "Albert Whitman, but please call me Albert." "Mr. Whitman," Manning emphasized, making the simple name sound like a diagnosis. "Since you're so eager to learn, perhaps you can enlighten us about Jacques Derrida's concept of difference and how it applies to contemporary narrative theory." The question was clearly designed to humiliate. Derrida's philosophical concepts were graduate-level material that even literature majors struggled to grasp. Manning folded his arms, waiting for the inevitable stammering and confusion that would justify removing this intruder from his classroom. Albert set down his pen thoughtfully, considering the question with genuine interest. "Well, Professor, Derrida's notion of difference, with an A, is quite fascinating, isn't it? The way he plays with the French verb différer, meaning both to differ and to defer, creates this beautiful concept where meaning is always postponed, always slipping away from us." Manning's confident smile flickered like a candle in wind. That wasn't the response he'd expected from this confused old man. Albert continued, his voice gentle but increasingly precise. "When you apply that to narrative theory, It suggests that stories never really arrive at fixed meanings. Each reading defers meaning to the next, creating an endless chain of interpretation that resists closure. Several students looked up from their notes, suddenly more interested in Albert than in Manning. Michael leaned forward, his eyebrows raised in surprise. But Manning wasn't ready to surrender his position of intellectual superiority. "That's a reasonable surface interpretation," he said dismissively, "but you're missing the deeper implications. Derrida isn't just playing word games, he's fundamentally challenging Western metaphysics." "Oh, absolutely," Albert agreed, nodding earnestly. "Especially his critique of logocentrism, the idea that Western thought has always privileged speech, over writing, presence over absence. It's revolutionary when you consider how it undermines traditional notions of authorial authority." Manning's face was beginning to turn red. This wasn't going according to his carefully planned script of intellectual domination. "Mr. Whitman," Manning said, his voice dripping with condescension, "while I appreciate your enthusiasm, this is graduate-level discourse. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable auditing an introductory literature course at the local community college." The insult hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah actually cringed in her seat, while Jake looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. The cruelty was unnecessary and obvious to everyone in the room. But Albert simply smiled, with the kind of patience that suggested he'd weathered far worse storms than Professor Manning's wounded ego. "I'm quite comfortable here, thank you. Your insights are genuinely illuminating." "Are they?" Manning's voice was thick with sarcasm. "Then perhaps you can explain how Michel Foucault's theories of power and discourse relate to postmodern literary criticism." It was another trap, and everyone knew it. Foucault's philosophical frameworks were notoriously complex, requiring deep theoretical knowledge that took years to develop. Manning was essentially asking Albert to perform brain surgery with a plastic spoon. Albert tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question from multiple angles. "You're referring to Foucault's understanding of how power operates through discourse, creating subjects rather than simply oppressing them?" Manning nodded curtly, thinking he finally had Albert cornered in intellectual quicksand. "Well," Albert continued thoughtfully, "Foucault's insight that knowledge and power are inseparable does revolutionize how we read literature. Instead of seeing authors as creative geniuses expressing individual truths, we begin to understand how texts participate in larger discursive formations that shape what can be thought and said." The room was completely silent. Even Manning seemed momentarily speechless, his mouth opening slightly before closing again, like a fish gasping for air. Albert looked at him expectantly, his expression innocent as fresh snow, waiting for Manning to continue what he seemed to assume would be a fascinating academic discussion between equals. But Manning's eyes had narrowed dangerously. His pride was wounded, and wounded academic pride could be a very dangerous thing indeed. Manning regrouped like a general after an unexpected defeat, his intellectual ego demanding nothing less than total victory. He began pacing in front of the blackboard, his expensive shoes clicking against hardwood floors like a countdown to something inevitable. "Interesting observations, Mr. Whitman," he said, though his tone suggested they were anything but. "However, you're still operating at a rather elementary level. Let's explore the real scholarship." He turned to write on the blackboard, chalk squealing against the surface as he scrawled, "Lacanian psychoanalysis plus post-colonial theory equals." "Now then," Manning announced, spinning around with theatrical flair, "can anyone explain how Jacques Lacan's theory of the symbolic order intersects with post-colonial literary criticism. The graduate students shifted nervously. This was high-level theoretical territory, the kind of complex academic jargon that separated serious scholars from pretenders. Several students flipped frantically through notes, searching for anything that might help them navigate these treacherous intellectual waters. Albert, meanwhile, continued writing in his journal, seemingly unbothered by the escalating academic complexity. "No volunteers?" Manning's voice carried mock disappointment. "Mr. Whitman, since you seem so confident in your theoretical knowledge." Albert looked up, his fountain pen poised above his page like a conductor's baton. "Oh my, that's quite a sophisticated intersection. Lacan's work on desire and lack certainly provides fascinating insights for examining colonial subjects, doesn't it?" Manning's eyebrows shot up. Albert was engaging with the theory rather than retreating into confused silence. "I mean," Albert continued thoughtfully, "when you examine post-colonial literature through Lacanian theory, you see how colonized subjects are positioned in what Lacan might call the imaginary order, constantly trying to achieve recognition from the colonial other, but never quite succeeding because that recognition is structurally impossible." Michael dropped his pen with a clatter. Sarah's mouth fell open. This gentle grandfather was casually discussing psychoanalytic theory like he was commenting on the weather. But Manning pressed forward, his voice growing sharper with desperation. "And I suppose you're familiar with Homi Bhabha's concept of mimicry as well?" Albert nodded with genuine interest. "Yes, it's brilliant how Bhabha shows that colonial mimicry is never quite successful. It's almost the same but not quite, which creates a space of ambivalence that actually undermines colonial authority." The professor's jaw tightened. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Academic intimidation was his specialty, his method for maintaining intellectual hierarchy. Yet here was this elderly man, dressed like someone's retired accountant, calmly dismantling his assumptions with every response. "Perhaps," Manning said through gritted teeth, "you're more familiar with contemporary criticism than I initially assumed. But are you aware of the latest debates surrounding decolonizing literary theory itself?" It was another loaded question designed to reveal gaps in Albert's knowledge. Current academic discourse was highly specialized, constantly evolving, requiring intimate familiarity with the newest scholarly journals and conferences. Albert set down his pen and folded his hands carefully. "Oh yes, scholars like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Gayatri Spivak have raised crucial questions about whether Western theoretical frameworks can ever truly serve decolonizing purposes, haven't they?" He paused, then added with gentle precision, "Though I think some of the most important work is coming from indigenous scholars who are developing entirely new theoretical approaches rooted in their own epistemologies, rather than trying to reform European frameworks." Jake looked around the room in amazement. Those were cutting-edge debates he'd only encountered in the most recent academic publications. Sarah scribbled frantically, trying to capture Albert's insights. Manning felt the ground shifting beneath his feet like quicksand. Every attempt to expose this man's ignorance only revealed deeper knowledge. But rather than admitting defeat, his competitive instincts kicked into overdrive. Impressive theoretical knowledge, he conceded, though his tone suggested the opposite. However, theory without practical application is meaningless. Real scholarship requires original research, primary source analysis, archival work. His voice grew louder, more aggressive, echoing off the classroom walls. Have you ever actually contributed anything to the field, Mr. Whitman? Or are you simply regurgitating other people's ideas, like some kind of academic parrot? The challenge hung in the air like a sword, suspended by a thread. Manning stood with arms crossed, his expression triumphant, believing he had finally cornered his unexpected opponent with an unanswerable question. Albert looked down at his weathered hands for a moment, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover of his journal. When he looked up, there was something different in his eyes, not hurt or anger, but a kind of quiet amusement, as if he were watching a child who had just discovered the ocean was deeper than they'd imagined. Original research, Albert repeated softly, his voice carrying new authority. Primary sources, archival work. He opened his briefcase with deliberate care and withdrew something that made several students gasp audibly. It was a manuscript, yellowed with age, covered in handwritten notes and editorial marks. Albert held it carefully, like someone handling a butterfly's wing. Well, Professor Manning, I suppose that depends on what you consider original research. This, for instance, is an unpublished manuscript by James Baldwin, discussing the theoretical frameworks we've been exploring today. The room erupted in whispers. Sarah actually stood up to get a better look. Michael's eyes went wide as dinner plates. Manning's confident expression began to crack like ice under pressure. "That's impossible," Manning stammered. Baldwin's unpublished work is held in private archives, not accessible to the general public. Albert smiled with gentle patience. "You're absolutely right. They're not generally accessible. But when you've spent 40 years building relationships in the literary community, certain doors open that might otherwise remain closed." He carefully placed the manuscript on his desk and reached into his briefcase again. This time he withdrew a small digital recorder and a stack of cassette tapes. "These contain interviews I conducted with Baldwin, Toni Morrison, and Chinua Achebe between 1985 and 2003, Albert explained. "Conversations about the very theoretical questions we've been discussing, how Western literary theory both illuminates and obscures post-colonial experience." The silence in the room was so complete, you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. Manning's face had gone from red to pale, the color draining like water from a broken dam. "You see," Albert continued, his voice maintaining its gentle cadence, "I've been researching post-colonial literary theory since before some of you were born. I've published 12 books on the subject, over 70 scholarly articles, and my work has been translated into 15 languages." He paused to take a sip from his thermos, completely unbothered by the stunned faces surrounding him. "Perhaps you've heard of Voices from the Margins, Decolonizing Literary Discourse. It won the Modern Language Association's Distinguished Scholar Award in 1998. Michael actually gasped out loud. That book was considered foundational in the field, required reading for anyone serious about post-colonial studies. Sarah had quoted it extensively in her dissertation proposal. Or maybe you're familiar with The Syntax of Resistance, Language and Power in Post-Colonial Literature. Albert continued with increasing warmth. That one required 15 years of fieldwork across 4 continents, interviewing writers who were creating literature in the aftermath of colonial liberation. Manning's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd been trying to teach swimming lessons to a dolphin. "The thing is," Albert said, turning to address the students rather than Manning, "I've never been particularly interested in academic celebrity. I've always preferred to let the work speak for itself." He glanced back at the professor with twinkling eyes. But sometimes it's important to speak up when someone confuses credentials with wisdom, position with knowledge. Jake found his voice first. "You're A.J. Whitman?" he breathed. "Oh my God, you're A.J. Whitman." Albert nodded with humble satisfaction. "Albert James Whitman, yes, though I've always preferred just Albert." The recognition rippled through the room like an earthquake. A J. Whitman was a legend in academic circles, a scholar whose work had fundamentally shaped how people understood post-colonial literature. His books line the shelves of every serious student of world literature. "I cited your work throughout my thesis," Sarah said, her voice filled with awe. "Your analysis of linguistic resistance in Caribbean literature completely changed how I understood the relationship between language and identity." "That's wonderful, dear," Albert replied warmly. "I'd love to hear about your research sometime." The next generation of scholars always brings fresh insights. Professor Manning stood frozen at the front of the room. His earlier arrogance had collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. He had just spent an hour trying to humiliate one of the most respected scholars in his own field, a man whose work he had assigned to his students, whose theories formed the backbone of modern post-colonial criticism. "Professor Manning," Albert said gently, his voice carrying no trace of triumph or revenge. "Shall we continue our discussion? I believe you were making some excellent points about the intersection of psychoanalytic and post-colonial theory." The transformation in the classroom was immediate and profound. Where moments before there had been tension thick enough to cut, now there was an almost reverent silence mixed with electric excitement. The students had just witnessed something unprecedented. Not just an academic revelation, but a masterclass in grace under pressure. Manning stood motionless, his carefully constructed persona crumbling like ancient parchment exposed to light. I had no idea," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The arrogance that had defined his entire teaching identity seemed to drain from him like air from a punctured balloon. Albert looked at him with the kind of understanding that comes only from decades of experience with human frailty and academic ego. "How could you have known? I certainly don't look like what people expect a distinguished professor emeritus to look like." He gestured to his simple cardigan and comfortable shoes with self-deprecating humor. "I've never been one for academic pomp and circumstance. I'd rather spend my time in libraries and with writers than at conference cocktail parties discussing my achievements." The students watched this exchange with fascination. They were witnessing something unprecedented. Professor Manning, the man who had never met a student question he couldn't crush with intellectual superiority, was learning humility in real time. "Your assumptions about me," Albert continued softly, "weren't really about me at all, were they? They were about what you thought someone like me, an elderly man without obvious institutional markers, could possibly contribute to your classroom." Manning's face reddened, but this time with shame rather than anger. "Yes, I made terrible assumptions. I am deeply sorry, Dr. Whitman." "Professor Whitman, technically," Albert corrected with a gentle smile. "But Albert works just fine, and your apology is accepted, of course. We all make assumptions. It's human nature. The key is what we do when we realize we've been wrong." Albert stood up slowly, his movements careful but dignified, and walked to the blackboard where Manning's earlier notes still remained. Picking up a piece of chalk, he wrote in elegant script, "Wisdom has no age limit, knowledge wears no uniform." "You know," he said, turning back to face the class, I've been visiting universities as a guest scholar for over 30 years. I've seen brilliant 20-year-olds and closed-minded 70-year-olds. I've met janitors who could discuss philosophy and professors who couldn't see beyond their own egos. Michael raised his hand tentatively. Professor Whitman, Albert, how do we avoid making the same mistakes Professor Manning made? Albert's smile was radiant. By remembering that every person you meet knows something you don't. Every single person, the homeless veteran on the street corner, the barista making your coffee, the student who asks what seems like a simple question, they all carry knowledge that could surprise you. He walked back to his desk and began carefully packing his fountain pen and journal. Professor Manning made the mistake that many academics make. He confused institutional position with intelligence, credentials with curiosity. But wisdom doesn't require a title, and insight doesn't come with an age requirement. Manning cleared his throat, his voice stronger now, but still humble. Dr. Albert, would you consider giving a proper guest lecture? The students deserve to learn from someone of your caliber. That's very kind, Albert replied, closing his briefcase with a satisfying click. But I think today's lesson was exactly what everyone needed to hear. He looked around the room, his gaze touching each student's face with genuine warmth. The most important things we learn aren't always found in textbooks or academic journals. Sometimes they're found in moments exactly like this one. Sarah spoke up, her voice filled with admiration. How do you stay so calm when someone's when someone's treating you badly? Albert chuckled, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Oh, my dear, when you've lived as long as I have, you realize that other people's bad behavior usually says more about them than it does about you. Professor Manning wasn't really angry at me. He was afraid of losing authority in front of his students. He picked up his worn briefcase and thermos. Besides, getting angry would have prevented me from enjoying the look on all your faces when you realized who I was. That was worth the price of admission. The laughter that followed was warm and genuine, including from Manning himself, who was beginning to see the humor in his own spectacular misjudgment. As Albert made his way toward the door, the entire class rose to their feet in spontaneous applause. The sound echoed through the Gothic hall like thunder. Remember, Albert called back to them, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent in pursuit of knowledge. Question everything, assume nothing, and always treat every person you meet like they might just teach you something extraordinary. The applause continued as Albert Whitman walked out of the classroom, leaving behind a group of students and one very humble professor who would never again assume they knew someone's worth based on appearances alone. In the silence that followed his departure, Professor Manning looked at his students with new eyes. Well, he said quietly, I think we all just learned the most important lesson of the semester. And in that moment, everyone understood that sometimes the greatest teachers come in the most unexpected packages, carrying wisdom that can't be measured by degrees or titles, but only by the depth of their humanity and the generosity of their spirit.